Welcome to the Oracle Mobile and Social presentation. My name is Anant Kinney. I'm part of a group called Platform Technology Solutions. Within development, we are responsible for partner enablement. This is the standard safe harbor statement. And let's look at the agenda. So we're going to go through Oracle Access Management 11G R2 overview a little bit briefly, and then we're going to go through Mobile and Access Management, specifically discussing on Oracle Mobile and Social. We're going to go through Oracle Mobile and Social customer case study, and then we're going to take a look at a short demo of Oracle Mobile and Social. Let's look at Oracle Access Management overview. You know, we released 11G R2 last year, and the goal for 11G R2 was to provide a complete integrated access management suite. So we did that as part of 11G R2, and then obviously, as part of that integration, access management, the Oracle Access Manager got merged. It got changed to a Java-based platform. And the goal was basically to provide end-to-end access management. We wanted to simplify it in terms of converging different products. We started that within the 11G R2, as you might have basically seen there, that we started converging the services. The identity federation, identity provider side of it got converged as part of the access management R2, 11G R2 release. And the goal here was basically to give you one UI and the converged product, one installation, and make it simplify in terms of integrating different components of Oracle Access Management. We wanted to have our access management solution to be scalable. So to that effect, we have done some scalability testing. We have tested it with around 250 million users in the LDAP repository and performed the access management test on top of it. So I have a slide on this which basically going to explain a little bit more. But essentially, we wanted to make sure that the access management solution is scalable in terms of very, very high volume of users. So that's what we have done within the 11G R2. And then we wanted it to be innovative, right? So to that effect, we have added mobile access management, which is what we are going to discuss today, and social integrations. Essentially, from a mobile user's perspective, being able to provide single sign-on capability, being able to provide risk analysis and step-up authentication as and when we detect risk, basically all of that mobile single sign-on sort of functionality is provided by this new innovative product that got released as part of Access Management 11G R2. We also wanted to provide social integration, social aspect for it. If somebody wants to access a protected resource that is protected by access management and still want to use their social identities, log in from Facebook, log in from Google, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. So that also was part of the mobile solution that was released as part of 11G R2. Compatibility, so that you can take chunk of these agents and point it to access management 11G R2 and then migrate agents over a period of time. So that's basically provided as part of the migration upgrade strategy. Essentially, the last point that is mentioned there, server-side coexistence, where you can, for a larger deployment, you can have access manager and the legacy or the Sun solution or Access Manager 10G solution, and then over a period of time, you can basically migrate those agents over to the newer Access Manager 11G R2 platform. Again, we wanted to provide a complete solution. Access management is not web single sign-on, typical web single sign-on anymore, right? So there's a lot of components that are involved in a complete access management solution. Obviously, there's federation involved. There's the social aspect of it, which, as I just mentioned, wherein which people would like to integrate or would like to access the resources using the social identities. There is fine-grained authorization involved. There is mobile and API security. Obviously, whenever the web services are exposed, either through REST or typical web services through SOAP, obviously you need to provide security to these APIs as well as risk analysis. So currently today, the access management 11G R2 platform caters to all of these different pillars that a customer can think of in terms of providing a complete end-to-end access management capability. And as I mentioned, one of the biggest sort of goals for Access Management 11G R2 was to converge different services. So we had different installs in the 10G world. The installers followed different approaches. It was not a standard basis. So we wanted to integrate that into a one single Oracle universal installer. We did that, as well as providing a single console for managing different components. So in terms of these products, you can basically think of it as different services rather than different products, because obviously we have provided you with the single installer, and essentially using these different services is as simple as coming into the console and turning it on and off, right? So for example, as you can see here, in the 11G R2 time frame, the same console offers you Access Manager, Identity Federation, Security Token Service, and Mobile and Social. So depending upon what exactly you want to use, what services that you want to use, you come here and basically enable those services and then make use of those services as well. So we are converging other components as well. In the upcoming next patch set, we are going to converge the Identity Federation's identity provider side of it into Oracle Access Manager, this converged UI, so that the entire Identity Federation becomes a single service. We are also moving on to converging Adaptive Access Manager service into Oracle Access Management platform as well, so that the goal is to provide a single installer and a single UI for managing all of these different components. As I mentioned, these becomes individual services rather than individual products, which you can basically switch on and off as and when you want those solutions. And the second point there is, as and when converge these services, it becomes easier to use these services. So for example, if you look at Identity Federation being a standalone product in 11G R1 timeframe, if you do want to use it with Access Manager, there is a lot of integration steps that you have to run. So all of that will be avoided, or all of that will be done for you when we converge these services. So for example, today, since the service provider side of Identity Federation is already converged, if you want to use Identity Federation as a service provider, you don't need to do anything, because all of those authentication schemes, so on and so forth, are already pre-built for you. And it's as simple as coming here and switching on the services and start using them. So coming back to the scalable part of it, as I mentioned, we did a 250 million user benchmark on Access Management platform. These 250 million users got loaded into OID, and the benchmark was basically done using the Exalogic platform with Exadata as the database. And what we achieved is around 3K transactions per second when we use one server, and 5K transactions per second using two servers, which basically translates to, if we had three nodes, essentially that translated it to 16 million transactions per hour for Access Manager. That is logging in, doing some actions, and logging out. So we were able to support, such a high volume of transactions using these kind of hardware and these kind of nodes. It was extremely scalable in terms of what we could do with Oracle Access Management. So coming back to the innovative part of it, again, one of the things that we did is basically we introduced something called identity context. The goal here is to gather the context information as and when user goes through different tiers. So, for example, when we come back to mobile solution, when somebody is trying to access the resources from mobile, we are going to basically gather the device characteristics. We're going to look at where the user is coming from, whether he's using VPN or not, so on and so forth. And the goal here is to gather that information as and when the user goes through mobile and social server, access manager, adaptive access manager, or you might have an entitlement server protecting different applications. And this different identity context information that we gather in different tier gets propagated downstream, so that the goal here is to then act accordingly based upon the information that we have gathered. For example, when you go through a mobile single sign-on or mobile device, we can gather the statistics about that particular mobile device, whether it's a jailbroken, what location that you are coming from, and act accordingly based upon those identity context information that we have gathered. So, for example, if you're coming from a device that we do not recognize, or the device is blacklisted based upon the analysis that we have done, we can ask you for additional information, or whether we can just block you from accessing information itself. So that's the typical use case that is possible because we gathered identity context information through these different tiers. So that's one of the important thing, and it's not only for the mobile solution, it's also for your non-mobile desktop applications. You can use this identity context information to change the behavior or change the content or change the level of assurance a specific user might have in that particular transaction or particular session. So that was about access management in a nutshell. So let's go on to mobile access management, again, a newer component that we introduced in 11G-R2. So what are all the challenges today? So the challenges are, when you come to mobile side of the house, there's a lot of bring your own device sort of shift that is happening today, right? So people would like to access information, but these devices are not something that corporate might have issued. There might be corporate devices that corporate issued, but there are non-corporate devices where people will show up with their own devices and they want to access information. So the question here, or the challenge, or the goal here is to secure those transactions, or secure those access, essentially when somebody accesses it through mobile devices. So obviously, from a mobile development perspective, they are actually focused on user experience rather than looking at the security. So the goal here is to provide security, but by doing, that particular aspect of mobile security, we can basically, secure the resources that are accessed by the users, and these devices may not be something that belongs to a corporate. This might be user's own device. On the social side of the house, social integration is a challenge today. Where you got a website, it might be a marketing or a survey website that you want access by the users, but you don't want them to go and create accounts and things like that. You want them to go and use their social identities, use their Facebook account or LinkedIn account or Gmail account to do that. So that's something that you want to do. And how do you basically allow such a use case wherein which you can pretty much do it pretty easily, and you should not be taking a lot of coding exercise, and do that so that you can not only expose those resources, but you can also gather who is actually coming in and looking at the content that you are actually publishing. So what does mobile access management do? Mobile access actually bridges the gap between your mobile devices and your traditional IAM control, right? So the key point here is that you might have your identity and access management infrastructure in place. You just want to extend that to your mobile access, right? Rather than writing something that is new, and that's what we wanted to do as part of mobile access management, right? So it's basically taking your existing IAM infrastructure and extending it to your mobile devices. So the mobile access management solution that we provide does exactly that. It's actually providing you that bridge between your mobile devices and the existing IAM control that you have in place. And as I mentioned, we provide the context-driven risk-aware access management. Obviously, because of identity context sort of functionality that we put in, we can gather information as and when user tries to access the resources from his mobile device and act accordingly for that particular context information that we got or for that particular device that user is trying to access from. So from a development perspective, we provide SDK for both iOS and Android so that you can basically use this SDK and then bridge your mobile device access into your traditional identity and access management infrastructure that you have already. And as part of it, as I mentioned, it does provide you strong authentication capability, offline authentication. You want to do the offline authentication wherein which, the SDK that we supply supports that kind of functionality wherein which it caches the credential and it can use the cache credential in doing the offline authentication. And obviously it integrates with Oracle API Gateway, something which is very important. Not only you want to provide security as and when you're logging in, but when you are doing a transaction through a mobile device or through a non-mobile device for that matter, you want to secure those API access. And that's what mobile access management also does, so that not only those login experience that you are securing, but you are also securing other API access from that mobile app when the user logs in and performs certain actions. In terms of social integration, again, the goal here is to allow social identities to be used in the infrastructure, right? So user might already have social identities, and being able to use those identities whenever they need it, rather than performing local authentication. Obviously, when you use social identities, you can also have them register for a local account and perform the local account linking as well. And it's a flow that can take as part of somebody that is trying to log in using social identity, wherein which once the social identity login happens, we can populate the registration form and ask them to register for your local account in your infrastructure. So that's something that can happen as well. But the point here is basically allowing user to use their social identity to go and sign on to your infrastructure or your resources that you have secured. So in terms of mobile authentication, as I mentioned, it is actually bridging your existing infrastructure. If you look at these pictures here, on the first left-hand side, that's your traditional local authentication, right? So that means that you might have an access manager, or you might be directly going into an LDAP using mobile and social. So you're doing that local authentication. The second picture is where it talks about social integration, right? So if you have secured the resource and you have said that, hey, I want to use local authentication, but by the way, I also want to provide ability to have social identities for this login experience, then obviously, however you have configured, all of those social identity options will show up, and then user can basically choose whichever they want to use, right? The last two screens are very important in an infrastructure where if Oracle Adaptive Access Manager is involved, it's very easy for you to hook up Adaptive Access Manager with this mobile and social infrastructure, right? So in that case, obviously it's going to go through and run the risk analysis as you're doing authentication, and it can ask you for additional challenge questions. That's your third screen there. And the fourth screen, obviously, since Adaptive Access Manager also supports OTP, and essentially we can do that as well, right? So it can send you an OTP either through an SMS or voicemail, and then you basically come here and enter your OTP code, and then if everything matches, then it basically allows you to log in. So the important aspect to understand here is that, making use of your existing infrastructure, right? Whether it's Access Manager or Adaptive Access Manager or, Access Manager, Adaptive Access Manager, and Mobile Social working along with social identities, whether it's Google using OpenID or Facebook using OAuth, we provide that capability for user to log in into the resources that he's trying to access. So mobile single sign-on, again, it's it's not only for a specific application, but it basically allows you to single sign-on into different mobile applications that are there on that particular device, and not only for mobile applications, native applications, but the mobile browser, right? So that's something that we're going to see it in the demo, wherein which you might have multiple applications within your mobile device, and a single application will act as a agent using the SDK, and then all other applications delegates authentication or use that application which is acting as an agent to do the single sign-on. So once you logged into one application, then you can basically seamlessly go back and forth between number of applications that are participating in single sign-on, as well as you can access through mobile browser, right? So it's a true single sign-on as well as single sign-off. When you do a single sign-off, you're actually signing off from different applications, whether it's a native application or web application that is actually participating from that mobile device in the single sign-on process. So how do we secure? As I mentioned, the key point is if you look at the right-hand side, existing infrastructure, right? So you got a access manager, you might have a adaptive access manager, you might also have a directory. Obviously, you would have it when you have an access manager, or you can directly go through a directory for doing direct authentication as well, right? So the key point here is that you're using your existing infrastructure, and the mobile and social server becomes a bridge between your mobile application and your existing IAM infrastructure. Again, having adaptive access manager is not a must, but if you do have adaptive access manager, it's going to provide you device registration, device fingerprinting, lost and stolen device rules. Obviously, we have enhanced adaptive access manager to do that for mobile and social. It provides you risk-based KBA authentication, and it also provides you the transactional risk analysis. Right? So I talked about once you logged into an application, when you want to do risk analysis for a specific transaction, that's also done through adaptive access manager. On the left-hand side, you would see a mobile application, and you might have any number of applications within that, but one application gets nominated as an agent in the sense that it is using Oracle Mobile and Social SDK to do all these calls, right? So in a corporate environment, you might choose a common denominator application that might be available for all the devices, right, as a common denominator. So that application might get nominated as a SSO agent, and that basically facilitates the single sign-on, risk analysis, jailbreaking detection. All of that is basically done by that specific application. So all the other applications, along with the web browser access, is basically using that security app that you have written using the Oracle Mobile and Social SDK to do that single sign-on and risk analysis. And as we drill deep down into it, again, from the mobile application itself, when you use SDK, it's making REST calls to mobile and social server, right? So from the mobile and social server, again, it's using the APIs of various services. So, for example, access management for doing single sign-on, it's using API to do that. It uses adaptive access manager. Similarly for directory services, right? So from the user's profiles perspective, when you log into the mobile app, if you want to browse users or if you want to look at the information about a specific user, it's basically using that user profile service to go through and look at the user information, pull the information from the directory server, and then present it to you in the mobile device, right? So all of this is basically done through APIs, and important to understand is that the mobile and social SDK communicates to server using REST. So here is the flow in terms of how mobile and social basically is used from a mobile single sign-on perspective. On the left-hand side, as I mentioned, you have a client application, right? So essentially, this is any app, native app that is stored in your mobile device. And then you have a security app. As I mentioned, this might be a common denominator app that you have developed using mobile and social SDK. So there are two ways of doing it. One, you might develop a security app that specifically does SDK calls, or you might have a common application that you think that it goes to every mobile device that you're pushing into, and that app can act as an agent as well, right? So you actually embed it into a specific app. So you can use it either way around. So here, you have a client application that is trying to access a resource that is protected by the mobile and social server, right? So obviously, when you did this configuration, you have nominated the security app as the SSO agent, right? So that is something that is done as part of the configuration. So now the client application knows that in order to get to a specific resource, it needs to go and use security application, right? So that's what really happens here. And as I mentioned, the security app itself, using the SDK, can store the credential locally, right? So if the credentials are there locally, then it basically looks at that, and then it basically allows it to access that particular application, right? In the sense that for the access, it needs an access token. It looks at the store whether the access token is already there, meaning that the user has already accessed a resource that is protected by the infrastructure, and it already has an access token. So if not, it presents a login page. It will accept the username and password, and then once it does accept username and password, it bundles the credentials, and it along with the credential, it actually bundles the device characteristic, in the sense that the application ID that you are trying to access from and the device information, all of that gets sent across to mobile and social server. Mobile and social server first validates the device. If it's a device that is not registered, it's going to go through a registration because it needs to register the device. If it's a registered device, then it will move on. It will authenticate to OAM server. In this case, access manager is something that is involved, and then it will publish the identity context information that I talked about. So that now, from an adaptive access manager's perspective, or there might be an OES involved, they can now use the identity context information. In this case, which device it is coming from, what is the health of the device, whether he's using, what location it's coming from. All of that information gets presented to Adaptive Access Manager as part of identity context. It gets published, and then Adaptive Access Manager can use that information to then look at whether it needs to have additional challenge questions for that specific user as part of the login flow, right? So all that really happens, and at the end of it, the mobile and social returns the access token, and the security app stores the access token within its secure store, and then it returns the access store to the client application. Now, the client application can use that access token to go and request access to the resource that it's trying to request to. So all of this in the middle that we have mentioned, it happens transparently to client application. Right? So all of this is basically done by SDK. So from Adaptive Access Manager perspective, as I mentioned, it's not mandatory that you should have Adaptive Access Manager, but if you do, you're going to get different statistics around it, right? What device that you are coming from, what is the health of the device, OS of that specific device, whether the device is jailbroken or whether it's a proper device. All of that information will be captured by Adaptive Access Manager. Again, Adaptive Access Manager is not a mandatory requirement, but if you do have, then it provides you this risk analysis and device fingerprinting and all of that. So when you use SDK, SDK basically does all of this functionality, right? So it is storing the access token, meaning that once you access the resource that is protected by the mobile and social infrastructure, it stores the access token so that your next request, you have the access token. So the mobile app can then use that token to get further requests. It will collect the mobile device information, it will send it across to mobile and social server. If there's Adaptive Access Manager, you can use that information. It will support knowledge-based authentication, support OTP via email and SMS, and it will also manage single sign-on. Right? So all of this functionality is essentially provided by SDK that we ship or that we supply for both iOS and Android. Right? So if you don't have this SDK, then you are basically trying to do everything yourself in the mobile app, and obviously providing single sign-on becomes difficult because all of that coding needs to be done by you. Right? That's the value of SDK that we provide. Again, one important point to understand is that we don't supply the app itself. App is your responsibility, but we supply the SDK so that you can use the SDK to make these calls. And you just need to make those calls, and essentially SDK then takes care of doing all of this for you. So extending, the single sign-on to API security, right? So once you logged into the infrastructure, then you might make several calls, right? So there might be certain transactions that you are going through and so on and so forth. API gateway essentially extends that to secure API calls that you might be doing, right? So here is the typical use case. Obviously, this might be from a mobile device or from a non-mobile device, wherein which you're making calls, and API gateway along with the entitlement server, it provides you that API security, masking information. For example, in this case, SSN, that is something that needs to be masked. Credit card information, that is something that it needs to be masked. So all of that is provided by the combination of API gateway and entitlement server. And as I mentioned, this is basically a valid scenario for both mobile and non-mobile applications, right? Whether you are accessing it from a mobile device or from a non-mobile device. But the point here is that API gateway allows you to do that API security once you kind of go through your traditional sign-on process and extending security to different API calls that you might be doing, whether from a mobile device or from a non-mobile device. Right. So again, going back to context-aware authorization, right? So I'm stressing the identity context and its users, right? So because we publish that information, you can use that identity context information to look at what needs to be provided for a specific request. So in this case, a user is trying to look at information for Bart Simpson, right? So based upon users' access varies, accessing from who the user is, so on and so forth, we can have logic to mask certain information from that specific user. Right? That is one use case. Then securing transactions, right? So based upon who the user is, where he is coming from, so on and so forth, when he's trying to do certain transactions. So for example, here he's trying to change the salary of Homer Simpson in this case, and it's actually protecting that particular transaction. Again, a combination of API security, API gateway, and entitlement server basically allows you to do this. So this is beyond your traditional single sign-on process. Once you logged into the application, providing security at the API level. Right. So why use mobile and social SDK? Again, as I mentioned, all of the left-hand side, sort of functionality is basically provided by the SDK, right? Whether it's the user profile services for browsing the user information, managing the client tokens, single sign-on, so on and so forth. Everything is basically managed by mobile and social SDK. And if you don't have SDK, that means that you're basically coding all that information by yourself, right? And offline authentication is something that is new in Patset 1 that we released, right? So being able to do the offline authentication using the cached credential in the SDK on your mobile device, and that's basically something that is stored in the secure encrypted cache. Being able to use that to do offline authentication. That is something that is new that we have introduced in Patset 1. And as I mentioned, from the SDK perspective, it does provide you different modules, right? It has an authentication module which is responsible for authentication, secure storage for storing your credentials, tokens, and so on and so forth, a user role module for browsing the user information when through your application, and cryptography for encrypting the tokens that is stored in locally, and it is also using or providing REST Web Services Handler module for making any of the REST calls for those calls that needs to be protected. So this is the mobile flow, right? So from a higher level, as I mentioned, when you go from a mobile device, you have an app that is trying to access a resource that is protected. Obviously, you have nominated an application as an agent application, right? So from your typical app, then it delegates to the agent app, and then agent app is responsible for collecting the credential, and it will basically, gather the credential. Along with the credential, it will send the device information to mobile and social. It does the validation of credential. It looks at the device. If it's not registered, then it will go through a device registration. And, once that is done, then it will basically go back and send the token back to the SDK. Now, from a mobile app perspective, it can use that access token to then make call to the resource that is trying to access, right? So now it has the access token. So if you look at a little bit deeper, there are three things that you need to remember, right? There are three things that are involved, or three tokens that are involved. The first token is client registration handle, which basically means that it identifies the device. The second token that you're going to get is user token. The third token that you're going to get is access token. So the user token you're going to get after you authenticate. Access token basically gives you access to the specific resource that you're trying to access, right? So from the client side, essentially, as I mentioned, the agent gathers your credential, and along with the device information, along with the application ID or the application from which you are trying to access, it will send all that information to mobile and social server. So mobile and social server first authenticates, and then it looks at the device. If the device is not registered, then it will going to go and register the device, and the agent is going to get a device registration handle. Then between agent and the server, it uses the client registration handle, and it uses that information to get access to user token, right? The agent says that, okay, I've got this device registration handle that you issued me. Now I know that you authenticated the user. Now give me user token. So it gets the user token and stores the user's token, and then passes the token back to the mobile application, right? So then there's another call that is made to get to the access token, right? So for doing that call, it says, okay, I've got the client registration handle, I've got the user token, meaning that I'm a authenticated user. Now give me my access token so that I can go and access this resource, right? So it gets you that access token. Again, the SSO agent stores the access token, passes it back to the mobile application, and the mobile application then uses access token to get access to the resource that it's trying to access. Right? So this is essentially the flow that you're going through when you access it from a new device that is not registered yet. So if the device is registered, then it says, okay, you have already registered. SSO agent might already have the client device registration handle. It says, okay, I've got the device registration handle. Now let me move on to getting the user token, right? So it skips the device registration handle flow, and it will directly go to getting user token, meaning authenticating the user and then getting the access token. So from a social identity perspective, the goal here is basically enabling applications to consume social identities, right? So making end user's life easier, wherein which if the user says that, I've got account in a social, site like Google or Facebook or LinkedIn, I want to use that identity. So essentially being able to use that identity, and from a mobile and social aspect, being able to work with OpenID or OAuth to get those social identity single sign-on possible, right? That's the whole goal here. This is the second piece of mobile and social infrastructure that we have. And as I mentioned here, the typical use case is on the left-hand side. You would see when the user tries to access, he's going to get a choice. This is, of course, your configured social identity support. Either you can use your local account or you can log in with your social account, right? So in this case, user has selected Google. So he's redirected back to Google. He enters his credential. Again, in this case, it's using OpenID. And then once the authentication is successful, Google is basically asking you a permission, right? Hey, this particular relying party is trying to get hold of this particular access token. Can I grant you that information, right? So that's what is happening here. once you do that, once you grant that information, that means that then it's basically passed on to mobile and social server. Now the user has authenticated, mobile and social server then gets you access to wherever you are trying to get to, right? And this is a typical flow here. You might have a portal wherein which you have published a resource. You're coming from a mobile device, or you might be coming from a non-mobile application as well. Right? So it works on both. So let's look at the mobile device perspective. As I said, you go to particular resource. It says that hey, it's protected by the social login. So the user gets directed to the login screen where you can pick the social identity, and then it goes back to Google or Facebook or what have you. And essentially, then you get authenticated there. In the case of OpenID, meaning in the case of Google, once you are authenticated, then it will send information to social, a token that contains user attribute information. So, the mobile and social can use that information to then, link or create a user account locally and then access or let the user access that information. In the case of Facebook, which is basically based on OAuth, there's a separate flow that happens. So the Facebook is going to give you the initial authorization token to access and mobile server, and it uses that token to get access to the specific access token, right? So it basically tells, I know that you authenticated this specific user. Here is your authorization token. Now give me access token for this specific user. So there is a second flow that happens, which is identified in step 5. It gets that access, and then basically you move on to getting access to the specific resource. That's the flow that really happens. But bottom line here is that being able to access information using social identities. Again, this is coming back to API security. Obviously, what we are allowing you to provide is that, extending security from a mobile device, from a typical single sign-on into protecting your API calls, right? So this is the typical architecture there from a mobile app, either through a native app or a mobile browser. For your initial single sign-on, you're basically going through the mobile and social server, and after that, any APIs that you basically make a call, it's protected by the API gateway, and then that provides security along with data masking and any of those functionalities or data redaction that you are trying to do as part of that use case. So in a summary, obviously mobile access management is something that allows you to bridge the gap between your mobile devices and your existing infrastructure by using the mobile and social server. And essentially, mobile access management does provide you that SDK which you use to write an application, either embed to an existing application or a newer application that you are writing. You embed those SDK calls so that you can basically make use of single sign-on, risk analysis, all of that as part of mobile single sign-on process. So let's look at customer case study. The first case study here is that it's an oil field company that they wanted to provide SSO for both their employees and contractors. So the challenges were the current mobile applications, these applications were ad hoc and they had limited security consideration because they were written quite a while ago. They wanted to expose their internal SOAP services as REST services for external consumption, and their existing web access is basically not suited for mobile application, right? So the typical use cases there were mobile SSO because they wanted to provide single sign-on from mobile device. They wanted their sensitive data to have additional protection using Adaptive Access Manager, and devices also needs to be registered, which meaning that they are using Access Manager, they're using mobile and access, social access for doing mobile single sign-on, they're using Adaptive Access Manager for device registration, so on and so forth, and then Enterprise Gateway for doing their REST, protecting their web services or API calls. The second use case is basically around automakers. So they wanted to manage the relationship of the car with the prospective buyer from the moment where the buyer looks for the car to when he buys that specific car, being able to register the car with the manufacturer and manage the applications that are within the car from the mobile application, right? Either through a mobile application or through the traditional desktop or laptop. And essentially the goal here is to provide security for those applications. So their requirement was mobile SSO, and then they also had apps that are actually by the car manufacturer as well as third-party apps. So those third-party applications need security without a lot of coding effort and things like that, as well as the social identity login, because prospective buyers might use their social identities to actually go and look at the cars that are available, so on and so forth. So the solution there was Oracle Access Manager, Oracle Mobile and Social, and Adaptive Access Manager, and Oracle Identity Federation for doing federation, because they had third-party apps like Pandora that were available in the car's dashboard as well. So these are the two use cases that basically where we have mobile and social along with the traditional access management and API gateway. So now let's take a look at demo. I have a quick demo which basically shows some of these mobile use cases. So let's actually go through that. So we are going to look at three use cases here. As I mentioned, this particular demo has two applications. One is a demo bank application, and the other application is a trading application. Right? Those are two native mobile applications, and it also has a mobile browser. So the first use case is that you're going to log in from the demo bank application, which is basically nominated as the SDK agent, right, or the SSO agent. So the demo bank has the SDK, calls. So demo bank is using the SDK to make calls to access management infrastructure through mobile and social. So it acts as an SSO agent. The second app is basically a trading app, which is based when you try to log into trading application. Since it's not an SSO agent, it will use the demo bank to actually go and do the single sign-on, right? Because the demo bank is nominated as the SSO agent. And the third use case that I have is accessing a resource from the mobile browser itself, right? Again, in that case, since the mobile demo bank app has been nominated as SSO agent, whether you are accessing from the native mobile client application or through a web browser that is stored in the mobile device, it's going to use the demo bank, which has been nominated as an SSO agent to do the single sign-on. So that's the typical use case that I have it in the demo. So let's first take a look at demo bank, right? So this has been nominated as the SSO agent. So in a traditional application, you won't really do this, but this actually shows you the server details, right? So wherein which we just fill the server information so that the app can actually make calls to the mobile and social server. But as I said, in a normal app, you code all of that. You don't show this to the specific user. User don't need to do any of these things, right? So that's what we are doing here. And there is also a REST service that we will be accessing, which basically gives information about the statement for the specific user, the monthly account summary. So that's what we are doing here. Again, this is something that is for demo purposes. In a real world scenario, you won't expose this for an end user, right? So this is already pre-populated, so the app knows where to go and talk to. So once you do that, the first, there are three buttons here. The first one is login button. This is the local login that basically we are providing, right? So once you log in, this is mobile and social. Agent is sending the information to mobile and social server, and then it uses the access manager, right? So now the authentication is successful. Now, as you can see here, when you go through an authentication, in this case, we also have adaptive access manager, right? As part of that authentication, we can call the adaptive access manager using the adaptive access manager security handler that we attach as part of the login process. Again, the important point to remember here is that it just takes attaching that OAM security handler to invoke OAM. It's as simple as that. You don't need to do any other additional work for invoking OAM. As long as in the login flow, you say that, after the login is done, hey, I want to do risk analysis. I have OAM. Let me go and attach the OAM security handler. As long as that is done, you basically can invoke OAM. So in this case, the user has already logged in. Since the OAM security handler is in place, it's basically going into OAM, running the risk analysis, and it has determined that, I want you to challenge with additional challenge question. That's what is happening here in this particular screen, right? So this is coming from OAM. Again, it's very easy to involve additional authentication if you have OAM in place when you are going through the login process, right? So we just completed the login, and you would see that authentication succeeded, and then basically I'm on to my summary screen, right? That's what is happening here. So now I click on account summary. Then I'm making the REST call to the service that is available, right? So it brings me the summary information. Again, we looked about a specific slide wherein which you can basically redact information and things like that. Those use cases can be done here, right? So let's take a look at, if this is a customer service rep that is trying to access information for some reason, and then you want to hide some sensitive information, you can redact that. A typical API gateway combination in this case, right? So this demo doesn't have it, but it's really easy to extend. This is after the sign-on into application. And then you click on My Offer. Obviously, it's a page that is also within the application, but since you're logged in, it's going to show you your offers, which is again a personalized page that might be coming, right? Then you click on your request checkbook. We talked about user profile services, right? So now it's using the user profile service that is exposed as part of the mobile and social to go and get the information about the user identity that's already logged in. So in this case, it's actually polling in the address field from the LDAP, and then it's basically displaying that back into the mobile app, right? And again, when you click on My Information there, it's going to bring you same information. Using user profile service, it's bringing in that information, and then you can edit that information as well, right? So again, when you edit it from a mobile app perspective, it again talks to the mobile and social service, and it updates the directory using user profile service. That's what we are showing here. Then you go back and look at the request checkbook. You would see the address updated, right? So it's bidirectional. So you did both read and write. So that's the first case, and then he's trying to log out, right? So the important point to remember is that XYZ Bank is the SSO agent, right? So this bank has the SDK calls embedded into this particular app. Now let's look at the other use case where he says open account, right? So in this case, opening of account is something, you don't have an account, right? So that means that you are going through an opening of account process, and that's actually done through a social identity login, right? So he has actually exposed social identity services for that. So when you click on open account, it's basically letting you choose which service that you want to use. So in this case, it's basically using Facebook, using OAuth, right? So the mobile and social server is actually using OAuth. So mobile and social service is RP, or relying party here. It went to identity provider, which is Facebook in this case, and identity provider authenticated the user. Then you're going back to RP, or the relying party. In this case, it's mobile and social, right? So you went back to XYZ Bank here because you just did a social identity login. Right. So this is the second use case from that particular XYZ Bank, right? So which is both a local authentication with Adaptive Access Manager and social identity login. So next we go to trading app, right? So this is a typical client. So remember what happens here. So he's trying to get to the trading app, and this is a client in the sense that this relies on the bank app to do the single sign-on, because the bank app is actually the agent. So you would see that when he clicks on login, it's actually taking you to the bank app's login screen, because the trading app says that, hey, I want to access this particular resource, but the bank app takes over because bank app basically acts as an SSO agent in this case. So a typical native app which acts as a client on that mobile device is using the bank app's capability to log in, right, essentially, because bank app has been nominated as the SSO agent from this particular device. Again, you go through the same flow, but you would see that you went back into the trading app, right? So what happened here? Trading app is a client app. It said that, I want to log in, and then it used the bank app because bank app has been nominated as an SSO agent. It provided the single sign-on. Then you basically directed back to the trading app because that's where you're trying to get to. Right? This is the second use case that we are seeing here. Then you can see, I'm in the trading app now, and when I click on myself, it shows me my information along with the update that I did. From India, it just did IN, and then I logged out. Right? So this is the second scenario where a native client application on that mobile device using a single sign-on, when it says that, I want to log in, it uses, it understands that the bank app is the SSO agent, so it uses that to go and do the sign-on. And then let's look at the third scenario, wherein which I'm actually using the browser that is on the mobile app, right? So I actually go there and I type a URL that is actually protected by the access manager, right? So I'm actually accessing index.html that is basically protected. And in this case, again, when you go through the browser, it understands that, it needs an authentication. Now you can see what happened there, right? It went back to XYZ Bank app because that has been acting as an agent for this particular mobile device along the different applications as well as when you access it from the web browser, right? So in this case, again, agent is actually facilitating that single sign-on. It completes the single sign-on process, and then you direct it back to your browser page that you are trying to get to, and that you would see it in a second. So in this case, essentially what happens is that you would see that the hello world showing up in the screen, that's the final page that he's trying to get to. So in this case, there's additional thing that happens where since you're going through the mobile and social server, once the successful authentication, mobile and social server injects the SSO cookie into the browser as well because you are trying to access it from the browser. But in summary, essentially we saw three use cases wherein which the first use case is you logged in from a demo bank app, which has been nominated as the single sign-on agent. We did a login there. We did a traditional login. Then Adaptive Access Manager came in. We also saw that when you went through open account functionality, we used social identity to facilitate that. And then we went to the second app, trading app. When you clicked on that, it understands that the bank app is the agent, so it delegated the single sign-on responsibility to that. It facilitated single sign-on. And the third use case that we saw that is from the browser, right? So if we went to browser, then again, the agent app takes over, provides the single sign-on, and then you went back to whatever requested resource that you're trying to get to.